Hello, everyone. Peter Maravellis here. Welcome to session 4 of Deconstructing Oligarchy, How Wealthy Elites Undermine Democracy and Our Survival on the Planet. We have made it to our final session of the day. For those of you diehards that have joined us for each one, thanks for your resilience. It's been great seeing you in the chat. An event like this one could not have happened without the support of a devoted group of people behind the scenes. I would now like to take the time to express our gratitude. A huge shout out to Will Scarlett over at Norton, to Patrick Hughes at Pluto Press, and Michelle Betters at Verso Books. Ever grateful to you all for all that you've done. As always, City Lights is beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. I'd like to take this moment, as is customary before each session, to pay our respects to those stewards of the land who were here before us. For this final session, we bring together all of today's participants in one final examination of the subject. We're honored to have back with us again Nancy Fraser, Robert Ovetz, and we're hoping Douglas will join us. He's a little incommunicado at the moment, but we'll be keeping an eye out for him and hopefully try to bring him into the discussion before the end of the session. I'm going to be moderating the discussion. I encourage everyone in the audience, this is your chance to ask questions. Please post them in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. We really want you involved. I will also be posting links with which you may purchase books by each of our guests, so please keep an eye peeled in the chat for that. So when we hear the word oligarch used in the mainstream media these days, it is often in reference to someone in another country, usually Russia, behaving badly. And then even recently, when it's been used in more kind of, references to homegrown versions, the way the word is framed makes it appear that the problem lies with individuals misbehaving to spite a system intended to operate for the greater good, when the truth of the matter is, it's really the very structure of our political and economic systems and the ideological framework that supports them that prevents equitable, fair, and sustainable forms of living. Our systems favor the ultra-wealthy. So what we hope to accomplish with this session is to bring together all the pieces of the puzzle, to bring together the ideas of today's lectures into a kind of a cohesive rapport with each other. So at the outset, I'd like to set up some ground rules for our session. I'd like to encourage each of you to feel free to respond to each other's comments and add to the larger discussion. I'd like us all to kind of interact, so feel free to ask, each other questions. I'd like this to be dynamic. So I think I'd like to start with the session by asking both of you at the moment. So what do you interpret as being at the core of kind of oligarchic ideology? And what new metaphors or memes do you think we need to begin generating to counter this? And I know Douglas, of course, would have had quite a bit to add, even though he's not here, because he's thought a lot about how metaphors and things, kind of translate and how we can communicate with each other. But just to begin the conversation with, how do we begin to kind of like creatively rethink the mess that we're in?
Shall I start, Robert?
Sure, please jump in.
I guess I don't think so much in terms of oligarchic ideology as in terms of capitalist ideology. I realize that's not exactly the same thing. But I would say that, the classic pro-capitalist ideology is some version of, let's say, free market fundamentalism, that, states are clunky and rigid and too coarse an instrument to do all the neat things that markets can do and that private businesses can do. That was certainly the ideology in the early stages of capitalism in the 19th century. It went away for a while during the New Deal, the social democratic phase of capitalism. It came back at the outset of neoliberalization. But I actually don't think that ideology is very persuasive today. I think that the sort of rise of right-wing reactionary authoritarian populisms on one side and whatever exists of sort of emancipatory left, anti-capitalist or proto-socialist movements on the other. You could just say Trump plus Sanders. That's almost like in America a critical mass. And that both sides, at least on the Trump side, appeared at first anyway to reject this free market fundamentalism. So I think today the more important ideology is not so much that as the famous Margaret Thatcher idea of Tina, there is no alternative. You know, capitalism is bad, but everything else is worse. And so I think it's part of our job, or my job, and those who, you know, feel implicated in this kind of project, to begin to think seriously about alternatives and to show that there are real alternatives. We're in, well, the last point, I think that the whole problem of ideology in general is that I think we're living in a period of what I would call hegemonic crisis. There's a vacuum of hegemony. There isn't a single, widely pervasive, widely convincing, accepted ideology. There's people speak of polarization. There's a kind of wildness. People believe the craziest stuff, the most pernicious stuff, and in some cases, really promising emancipatory ideas. And, you know, and some people maybe still believe in neoliberalism, but that has lost its sort of self-evidence. So I think this is a new situation ideologically that opens opportunities for out-of-the-box thinking, which is good, except when it's not good, because we get plenty of bad out-of-the-box thinking as well.
Robert, would you jump in and comment on all that?
Absolutely. You know, just to kind of build on what you're saying, Nancy, I think it's an old crisis, but there's also the same old tools being used, and we kind of have to reassess and relearn how these tools have been used in different forms in the past. So just kind of starting with the premise of the question is, what are the memes of the present situation? You know, there's a number that are well known. For example, that our economic system promotes free trade and open borders, pursues growth. You know, a rising tide lifts all boats. You know, we all benefit when the economy grows, that kind of thing. That's on the economic side. On the political side, we have the recurring memes or themes that we hear all the time. You know, we're approaching an election in just a number of weeks. And the famous theme or meme of, you know, elections matter. You know, the whole symbolism between, here I'm speaking within the United States, of the two hegemonic parties, which are really, for the most part, two branches of the same class, of the elite class. So these are things that, you know, we essentially associate with essentially the last 50 years of a period that, Nancy, you were talking about in your last hour, of essentially neoliberal capitalism. And I would say, unfortunately, you know, where I depart from what you were saying earlier is that I don't think we've left neoliberalism behind. I think of neoliberal capitalism as essentially, like you said, you know, there is no alternative. It was essentially made, you know, expanded globally by Thatcher and Reagan and at the end of the 70s, early 80s. And it was first tried out in Latin America, famously, and then brought to the global north. And essentially neoliberal economic policy is shrink the state. To summarize it, what is that shrinking for? Who is it serving? Who benefits from it? Essentially, it's tying the hands of government so that government can't intervene in the capitalist economy. This is not a new idea. In fact, as I was talking about, you know, my first hour, is that the US Constitution was designed to constrain political democracy and prevent economic democracy. And it does this by taking democratic control over the economy out of the hands of the people and putting it into the federal constitutional system, where the elites have the ability to impose their own minority will and block any sort of change that they want. What happened is in the 1960s and 70s, we started to see these mass movements, these insurrections happening. And the response was, we need to make some reforms in order to bring about class peace again. And that wave of reform had followed on the previous wave of reform of the 30s and so forth. We've gone now 50 years without any sort of reform. And I think that we're at a period now where we're seeing an uptick in the growth of a real workers' movement, where we're seeing companies that we were told for decades can't be organized because these are service workers and they don't stay around very long and they have 3 jobs and they don't have time to organize. Well, we're seeing all those myths blown up. Starbucks, Costco just the other day, Home Depot, as well as the big blue chip companies like Apple and Amazon. And this kind of gets to the question that somebody had put in the chat, is that we're seeing a kind of crossroads here after 3 years of a pandemic, which is not over by any means. We saw, in the terms of a crisis, a global public health crisis, we saw really the development of some reforms that were really short term. But it wasn't just the pandemic crisis. It was also really the resurgence of an organized working class. There's this great news service, and I'm just going to tie it up here. There's a great news service called Payday Report that's run by a labor reporter. He documents the number of strikes in the United States. And in the first several months of the pandemic, there were over 600 wildcat strikes around the United States. There have been also hundreds more throughout Europe and Latin America. And we haven't seen that abate at all. We've just seen the upward growth and a kind of resurgence of a workers' movement. So I think we are at a crossroads, and I think we're either going to see a kind of slap back and repressive policies like jacking up interest rates, and we can talk more about that, or a kind of continuing pivot to the authoritarianism of our last president.
Should I intervene, or does anyone else want to?
Douglas, can you hear us?
Yeah. Hey.
Yeah, why don't you jump on in?
Sure. Well, I just got here. I thought this was at my 9 o'clock. Not. It looks like you started at 8. Well, greetings all. Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, I haven't been following the conversation from where you started, but from what I know about what we were going to talk about, I mean, my concern of late has been a form of almost intellectual disaster capitalism that I see. I feel like there's a lot of us have been, destabilized by the events of the last 5 or 10 years. People are confused and disoriented, and I feel like there's a group of, and some explicitly calling themselves this, but a group of people who are offering to help us make sense of what's going on. But they're inventing kind of new intellectual systems like meta-modernism, and they've got all these different names, but they're basically very abstracted forms of thinking that use metaphors rather than conditions on the ground to help people orient themselves. And it's really consonant with things like Web3 and virtual reality and digital platforms, because they're invented. You kind of clear-cut reality or pretend it's not there, or in these cases, kind of pre-colonize, pre-gentrify, pre-sterilize these mental constructions and get people thinking up there and working up there. And I'm actually afraid it's a way of lulling people into support for authoritarianism and fascism. I mean, pretty directly. And you can also look at conditions on the ground and see, oh, look, Peter Thiel is funding an anti-woke film festival on the Lower East Side of New York, as a way of almost making this accelerationist drive hip, and when I see this many forces, this many friends, even really, that I have in technology, in literature, getting kind of seduced into this way of thinking as a new hip contrarian identity and ethos. What I'm feeling is a kind of a well, I don't even need to name names, but it's a kind of a Gamergate Steve Bannon, Ayn Rand meets Evola meets crypto meets Desjardins. I start to think, wow, there's like this weird sort of quasi-intellectual poetry going on that's ultimately, I feel like it's the most dangerous thing going. And I feel like I'm watching different people get picked off into it. And I get that it might feel good and trippy and psychedelic right now, but there must be a way to restore a little bit of, if not Marx, which would be my preference, at least reality to our counterculture. I mean, I feel like Are You Serious once said it, Operation Mindfuck worked too well. And instead of now it being Abby Hoffman and Paul Krasner destabilizing the consensus narrative in order to open people up to peace, love, harmony, and countercultural values, it's the far right and neo-fascists using the same kind of destabilizing, I'm only kidding joke techniques in social media, which of course favors them, to promote a very anti-human the nicest way to say it, anti-educational, anti-government, anti-media sensibility that we may have to reckon with sooner than later.
So Nancy, I want to, you were about to say something, and I want to see if I can.
Sure.
Hold on. You need to be unmuted, so I'm trying to do that now.
Sorry, I thought I was. I'd be happy to say something, but I do see that Sherry has a hand raised if you want to call on her first.
Hold on. Let me see if I can go to gallery view. There's a lot of people in the room. Yeah, let me, hi, Sherry. Do you want to say something?
Okay, yes, I do. Capitalism, all of our economic systems, our political systems are socially, we created them. They're human creations. They are not natural. Okay? And if you have a system that we create that serves such a few people and damage is unnatural to the environment, it's not going to survive, period. It's not. Okay. It stresses transactional relationships rather than interdependent relationships. It doesn't work. Okay. There are plenty of other ideas out there and different models for different places. I worked with AT&T. It was a monopoly. It was regulated because it was a service, okay, that everybody, it was infrastructure, okay? So there's all sorts of different ways of organizing how we do business together. The solutions are out there. We have to change our minds. And I think Douglas had a very good point. We have to start treating our oligarchs with the contempt they deserve. They can't eat money. So if we stop buying what they provide, they can't eat money. So on the basis of this, I'm very impassioned about this. I don't think any one system is going to solve the problem. I think a bunch of them together, based on the context within which they operate, it would be a mixture of a bunch of these ideas in different contexts, but the profit motive got to go. It's got to go.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you for this. Nancy, you were about to say.
Oh, well, now, I mean, this is so interesting. I've got many things to say. Well, just in response to Sherry's comment, I completely agree that capitalism was a human creation, and Karl Polanyi famously argued that the free market was planned and social protection arose naturally. So in other words, there's a case where the capitalist ideology has things exactly backwards. And you're probably right in the long run that it won't survive, mainly because the planet will go up in flames, or there'll just be, you know, some horrendous breakdown. But I think our question is, can we intervene and not let it die in that way, but at our hands, so to speak? Can we put the system out of its misery and create an alternative? I agree that there are lots of interesting ideas. I thought it was so interesting to listen to Douglas, because I move in very different circles. I teach at the New School for Social Research. I'm actually now teaching also at Dartmouth College, which is, you couldn't ask for the other end of the spectrum. But I want to tell you that for young graduate students and college students, there is a hunger for left-wing thought. People want to learn Marx. They carry around copies of Rosa Luxemburg. They're interested in Kropotkin, all kinds of stuff. I don't even know where they hear about this from, but there's a kind of renaissance, at least among young, you know, left-leaning. They're finished with discourse theory and, you know, the forms of sort of discursive idealism that dominated, that was trendy earlier. So there's something in the winds. And I guess I want to say that the most important thing is to figure out, in my view, how to pivot on the left from a period in which there was a tremendous amount of creativity and that resulted in a lot of insights from the project of articulating group-specific standpoints and problems that hadn't received adequate attention previously. I think now what was called for is a pivot from that to more integrative thinking, to thinking about the larger social systems that generate group-specific forms of oppression, injustice, vulnerability, and so on. And, you know, some people, when they hear that, think, uh-oh, you know, return to Leninism or something, and, you know, and they worry. But I'm seeing more and more that there is a hunger for integrative thinking. And I mean, some symptoms are the huge popularity of the term intersectionality. And I personally think that I sort of support what I imagine the political project behind that term to be, but I think as an analytics, it's not adequate. But it's a symptom. People are also talking now about racial capitalism. Now that's a switch from a period in which any talk about racism and racial oppression was within a liberal paradigm or a post-structuralist paradigm. To bring it back to this historic phrase associated with Black Marxism is a very important shift. I mean, just the surprising renaissance of democratic socialism in the United States as a term that people want to claim in a positive way. These are all social reproduction theory in feminism. That's code for Marxist or socialist feminism. And I mean, I've been a Marxist feminist for forever, but it was very hard to fill a room with people who shared that. Now, social reproduction. So in other words, I see all this as symptom. And granted, I move in a somewhat rarefied intellectual environment. I can't say this is necessarily mass stuff, but I see an interest in this kind of pivot. I think all of those approaches, those intellectual approaches, are aimed, however adequate or inadequate, at this kind of integrative thinking. And I was very sympathetic to what Robert was saying about working class organization. This again, surprising and impressive renaissance of union organizing, including among sectors that the historic labor unions would have thought were unorganizable, and so on. And there's tremendous support and sympathy in the larger population for those efforts. And that's all very interesting. What I want to add to that conversation, and then I'll stop, I've been going on too long, is the idea, I'm a proponent of what I call an expanded view of capitalism, meaning it's not just an economy, it's the cannibalistic relation between the economy and social reproduction, public goods and public power, nature, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in the same way, I think we have to rethink what we mean by the working class. I want an expanded view of the working class, which includes care work, whether it's paid, underpaid, or unpaid. That is socially necessary labor. And the same is true of all the forms of expropriated or dependent, unfree, or semi-free labor that I referenced at least briefly in my talk on COVID. In other words, capitalist societies depend on three faces of labor, not just exploited labor, but also expropriated labor and what we might call domesticated labor of care work. We have to, gender and race are central to class. These are not, I can't say when people say gender, race, and class, as if these are like three different things. Class is gendered and raced because of this structural thing. So I want I see the integrative project as, well, there are many proposals that could be very interesting, but for me, what's important would be to sort of find new ways to talk about the working class that don't immediately suggest, the white male factory worker in Detroit a la 1950, say. And if I don't know how to do it, but this would be a way of getting into that ideological contest we were talking about before. Because as I said, I agree with Robert that neoliberalism persists as a regime and as a policy. But as an ideology, it's lost its convincingness for all sorts of people. And that gives us an opening to produce a counter ideology, a counter hegemonic ideology that would be an alternative both to the reactionary authoritarian populisms and, very important, to what I've called progressive neoliberalism, the neoliberalism that dresses itself up as pro-feminist and green capitalist and black faces in high places, and so on.
Yeah, can I yes and onto that? I mean, my yes and would be, and I teach in City College, so I'm seeing a whole other population of working class people, mostly working class people of color, and way more women than men in my classes too, which is the new trend, I guess, in public colleges. But my yes and is, while I'm happy for people to be working on a new counter hegemonic ideology, and one that is certainly, hopefully, more compelling than the one that Steve Bannon and Peter Thiel and the new elite hipsters on Eldridge Street and Lower East Side are working on. I also hesitate. I put it this way: my commitment is not to create a new, almost a scaled golem against their the terrible monsters of capitalism, because there's such power for the working class, for real people. There is such power in refusing to scale. In it, 90 or 99% of us can focus almost entirely on reviving our own communities, on local agriculture, on sharing with our neighbors, on rather than having 10 minimum viable product hand drills on our block, having one good drill that you find out who has it this week and you borrow it from them, and realize that, yes, we're going to be buying less drills, and that's bad for the drill company, but maybe we're not in service to the economy should be in service to us. So that the more pressure, the less dependent we are as communities on these long supply chain, scaled, Walmart-based global economic products, the less power those institutions are going to have over us, and the less power neoliberalism is going to have over us. And it's hard because on a certain level, the Bannons are right in that the neoliberals are trying to, and Davos and the World Bank and whoever it is, are trying to exploit our genuine concern for climate, our genuine concern for the southern continents, with huge scaled, highly profitable energy transitions and things that are not necessarily what's going to make the world safer. In other words, transitioning to renewable energy over the next 10 years would dig more rare earth metals out of the ground than we could tolerate. We'll all die before the 10-year transition is up. So there's a lot of cynicism in the sort of Bill Gatesian plans for remaking the world in a more technocratically sound fashion. But I just find tremendous power, particularly in where I teach in Queens, tremendous power with people returning to communities and learning self-sufficiency as communities. They don't really need to know ideologies, and the ideologies disappear when you're digging your neighbors out from under Hurricane Ida. All of a sudden, it doesn't matter that this guy's MAGA and this guy's Bernie. We all just want to get the mud off our neighbor's house, and the ideologies kind of vanish, which is it's a more heart-leveled form of economic solidarity, but it tends to last longer and better.
Robert, could I have you jump in? I see the gray cells firing off.
Yeah, this is a really interesting line of discussion, and I would tend to agree with you, Douglas, that I don't think the project is really focused on creating a counter ideology. What I'm most interested in is looking at what people are already doing and trying to understand how people overcome the powers of the elites, of the structure of our capitalist society, of race, of gender, and find ways to work with each other and develop new tactics and strategies to counter, for example, many of the technologies you were talking about earlier today, Doug. Whereas where my interest is not on the gaming side or the social media side, but how are those technologies really being introduced in the workplace to control and to exploit? And what I see is, I'm in a similar situation with you, Douglas. I teach in a public university. I also teach community college, and most of my students, we would say, are working class. They're primarily students of color. Sometimes among a very small minority of people who are white in the classroom, also increasingly female and non-gender conforming. And the one experience that I see that my students are facing is really kind of comes out the very first day of every one of my classes when I poll them. How many of you are, taking, part-time in school or full-time or above? Most hands are full-time and above. How many of you are working a job that's paid or unpaid? You know, you have family responsibilities or you have a paid job. Almost every hand goes up. How many of you have two of those? About a half the hands go up. How many of you have more than two? Maybe a third of those students. And it's right there in that classroom that I see these students going deeply into debt, becoming trapped by debt, and more so trapped by 2 or 3 very low paying jobs, as well as unpaid housework. And when I look out at the kinds of organizing that's happening among the working class, I see the same people. I see people who are working 2 or 3 jobs, people who are single parents, they're trying to balance all the unpaid housework, they're people of color. And that's where we are seeing an emergent insurgency that's happening right now. And I just want to kind of tie this into the very first question that Julie had posted in the chat. And even though it's kind of in a different direction than where this discussion is going, I think it's important for us to understand what the terminologies really mean. And, you know, we're in the middle of generating a lot of fear about inflation, and the Federal Reserve is jacking up interest rates. Well, I was earlier, before we started our series today, I was actually writing a piece. I'm a labor writer for Dollars and Cents and for the Chief magazine, and among everything else that I do. And I was writing a piece about inflation and interest rates. And the thing that we have to understand is that we have to look at how the elites function, the kinds of policies they're implementing, the new technologies they're developing and investing in and introducing, to understand that there is struggle going on. It's not quiet at all. And the need to raise interest rates is really a weapon in a class war against workers who are finally pushing up wages after about 50 years. And that rising slowly but surely in wages is happening because these folks that I'm talking about are actually getting organized. And they're not just organizing your typical union of white men. You know, those days are over, right? Neoliberalism dismantled all of that. This is a new working class, and they're not necessarily interested in labor peace. They're not necessarily interested in coming to a contract and going back to work and getting 30 cents an extra an hour. They want paid leave. They want so they can go home and share the unwaged housework. They don't want to work 2 or 3 jobs. They don't want to have to go into debt in order to get a higher paying job. And I think that if we're looking at, you know, what can be done, I think we can already look out and see that people are already doing it. And what does that mean? And how can we intervene in that and help bring in the history of previous struggles that folks are so eager to learn from? You know, if you go onto the Amazon Labor Union's website, I encourage everybody to do that. You know what's really fascinating about that website? You know, we hear a lot about Chris Smalls, who's really an amazing organizer, but on their website, they have about 50 full text books about the history of working class organizing. It's incredible. And one of your colleagues at City University, Douglas, Manny Ness, 5 of those books are by Manny Ness at Brooklyn College. And so that's where I think the most interesting and dynamic form of struggle that's really happening. And it's not old style unions at all.
Nancy or
Yeah.
Douglas, do you want to, jump in?
I do. I think that the 3 of us and probably maybe other people listening share a lot in the way of diagnosis of what's going on and what some of the deep roots of these processes are. But I think I might be the odd one out on one issue, and that is this question about scale. I believe that there is an enormous amount of what I would call emancipatory or potentially emancipatory engagement in this country and more broadly around the globe. And some of it takes the form of, you know, sort of what we normally mean by labor organizing. Some of it takes the form of struggles around social reproduction, struggles for housing, education, healthcare, clean water, and so on. Some of it is environmentally oriented, and some of it is anti-racist and anti-imperialist, Black Lives Matter, and so on and so forth. To me, the issue is not how to get people to move. They move when they have to move, when the spirit moves them. To me, the question is how to connect the dots between them. And this is a pernicious social system that is, there's one and the same social system, in my view, that is at the root of it: ecological crisis, social reproduction crisis, democracy crisis, economic crisis, racial justice crisis. One system, but it doesn't affect everyone in the same way. And people quite appropriately respond to what is the most pressing, urgent thing facing them. It's just that it's not the same as what is urgent and pressing and motivates action for someone else who's differently situated. But in my view, no one of these, let's say, problem areas or types of struggle is or could be sufficiently broad and powerful and visionary on its own in order to make the kind of structural change that I think is actually needed to solve any of these problems. So it seems to me that, that the problem is precisely to scale up. That doesn't mean creating a revolutionary party that, dictates a program under democratic socialism and you can't raise other issues. We don't even know yet exactly what the model of, it's at the very least cooperation, if it's not, some stronger form of connection. Minimally solidarity, but even solidarity is not sufficient. Some of our problems are really global. You can't solve a flooding in my backyard without a global energy transition.
I would agree that's true, but my question is what percent of the global population needs to be actively and intelligently involved in orchestrating the global solutions? So, for example,
I'll tell you my answer. I don't think it's about, I wasn't suggesting that everyone has to be involved in everything. People for whom that is most pressing will be the most committed or the most aware. They will have informed themselves and so on. But we're not going to tell African Americans who are being shot down in the street, stop protesting that and work on climate change. That's absurd. It makes no sense at all. So the question is, how can each of these constituencies doing what it is doing, what it rightly considers its priority, develop an understanding of what it's doing that involves the idea that it's the same fight at a certain level because it's one and the same system. You've called it oligarchy, I call it capitalism. It's one and the same system. And that's why I said before about integrative thinking. I personally don't use the word ideology very much, but Peter introduced this as our opening discussion. What's an oligarchic ideology? So I started thinking, okay, what's a counter hegemony? I prefer the Gramscian terms hegemony, counter hegemony, which forwards the idea of common sense. Common sense is the sort of set of shared background agreements that give people interpretive frames as to what language they use, what sorts of stories they tell to diagnose things. And if all the background assumptions are the ones that that Robert talked about, free trade, open borders, et cetera, then, the game is lost. We need different background assumptions, and we need to think about organization in a more integrative way, because it's not about, I don't think you can, we're really talking about changing the ground rules of the social system, not about trying to cut a somewhat better deal within the existing ground rules. Now, it's true, when people win better deals, they can feel empowered and moved to more radical and transformative ways of thinking, but not always. Sometimes they just want to take their gains and protect them and sit tight. So part of the question is, sort of how to imagine a radicalizing, expansive trajectory of social change, rather than the sorts of struggles that end up kind of freezing things.
Right. At the same time, though, simultaneously, workers at one factory can achieve worker ownership. Drivers in New York can create a version of Uber where they're the shareholders rather than someone far away. People in a town can create a local public bank. So that many people, and many of the kinds of solutions that they engender will also trickle up into a shared understanding of what works. So I think I'm just thinking that it goes in both directions at once. Because my challenge
that prioritized worker ownership ended up creating worker-owned firms that compete with each other.
Exactly, because my challenge, my personal challenge is that the emails I get are from people who say, I've got a solution. I'm going to build a blockchain that's going to organize the global blah, blah, blah in this giant way. So when I say scale, what I'm talking about are people that don't just want to do something. They want to build the website that aggregates the websites of all the people who are doing blah, 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 blah. So I'm trying to help at least some people work on the ground in their local solutions to do the kind of stuff that, Jessica Gordon-Nembhard talks about in terms of, courageous collective courage, is her book about Black communities that learn to self-fund. So I'm just trying to give sort of the majority of people the ability, yes, they should read Gramsci for sure. But the vast majority of people can do so much by meeting their neighbors and learning to share and seizing control of their becoming owners of the means of production, in that bottom-up way.
Maybe the alternative to the global blockchain is not the local community ownership, but the general strike.
Right, or debt strike, for example. Yeah.
Robert,
that everyone can
want to
do.
chime in?
Yeah.
Well, I think, Nancy, you make a good point about how it needs to, scale matters. And, I come back to how often our struggles are localized, not just in the way that, the examples you're giving, Douglas, but they're localized within the nation state. They're localized by borders. And we often don't connect them across borders. And there are those rare moments when there's an explosive insurrectionary feeling in the air where it does happen. For example, in the 1960s, or with the Occupy movement, which spread to 100 countries. Actually, it started in Latin America and the Middle East, and then it spread to the global north. Unfortunately, those kinds of movements are outside of where the power of capitalism lies. So it's easy for the capitalist economy to survive those kinds of disruptions. It doesn't disrupt business. It doesn't disrupt the distribution of goods and services. It keeps people at work. And then after hours, they go out and protest. And I would say that's one of the limits, too, of the Black Lives Matter movement, is that it was very much focused on reform. Defunding the police, which is virtually impossible to achieve unless you get rid of capitalism, because the history of capitalism is one of using forces of policing, which I talk about in my book. The Constitution enshrined militias, which were used as slave patrols and to carry out genocidal attacks on Native peoples. It enshrines it as protected in the Second Amendment, and we see where that's gotten us today. So I think we also have to distinguish between different kinds of these movements that we're talking about, that people from different parts of our society participate in, because ultimately, there's a downside to them as well. They've been highly influenced by NGOs in the last 40, 50 years. This is gonna be the topic of my next book that I'm co-writing with someone. And that is that the NGO model of issue-based activism has really supplanted a kind of organizing that directly targets the fact that we have a dominant capitalist economy and it's global. Our movements are local, while the capitalism is global. And I think that, where I've pivoted in the last decade or so is focusing on struggles around work, because that's how capitalism functions. Capitalism functions on the exploitation of labor, whether it's paid or unpaid. I wrote my, Nancy, I really connect with what you were saying earlier, because I wrote my graduate dissertation, my PhD dissertation, about unwaged student struggles, that schoolwork is unwaged labor. Preparing us to labor for a wage later, and connected it. I was very much influenced by the wages for housework movement, which I think social reproduction actually is ripping off and watering down in a way. But I think that we need to think about how these struggles connect. And I want to get back to one of these examples that I mentioned earlier. And that's the organizing that's happening in Amazon. And it's not getting a lot of attention, but I try to talk about it every time I can and write about it. And that is that Amazon workers have formed their own global network. These workers in Poland, in Spain, and Italy, and Germany, in Minnesota, and Sacramento, and Southern California, where there was just a self-organized walkout a month ago, as well as in Alabama and New York. These workers coordinate across borders against one of the world's largest corporations, and certainly one of the world's richest men. And I have to say that, yes, they are making gradual successes, but they are able to take on this global corporation at the global level. And while it's really small and there's a long way to go, I think we have a lot to learn from what they're doing, and something that we should be replicating 1,000 times over if we're going to change and get beyond capitalism and survive. Not just the human species, but all life on this planet is in dire, urgent danger. And we all know this, right? So what is going to be the most effective form of struggle that's going to help us get beyond capitalism? And I really think it has to be something that targets the capitalist economy directly from whatever form, but we can't let go of that as a target.
Can I bring up Occupy? Where do the three of you stand on something like that?
Well, I was actually marginally involved in Occupy Oakland, and I actually got beat up by the police and spent 2 days in jail, charged with, I think it was 3 felonies. And eventually I brought a federal lawsuit against the city of Oakland and the county of Alameda. And I like to say it paid for my daughter's first year at a UC this year. So, I kept that money in the bank, and I was like, I at least got 1 year covered for you. But Occupy was an impressive self-organized movement. It actually, the first day of Occupy was just last week, but it had its limits. And like I was saying earlier, it took people away from where our power is and brought us into the streets where the state has power. And even though we were in hundreds of cities, you could see how quickly the Democrats coordinated the repression of the Occupy movement. They stole some of the ideas, but they repressed the movement.
Yeah, it's true. The Democrats did to Occupy like what GM did to the Saturn, for a capitalist response. Occupy was a terrific learning lesson. But what we were trying to do, I was part of Occupy and Occupy New York. We were trying to create kind of protest as a new kind of a steady state. In other words, it wasn't the idea wasn't to protest against, but to create a new normative, a new experiment in sort of a normative, permanent revolutionary state, as I understood it. What we lacked was a theory of change. And I walked around, and I was already old. I was already whatever, in my 30s, and walking around, or probably early 40s, and seeing all the kids sitting in circles trying to go, okay, how does alternative currency work? Or, okay, how does revolution work? How does this work? And I was like, oh my God, that was what I went to get my PhD after that. I was like, oh my God, what they want is education, is to understand how to do, really how to do what Nancy's talking about. What is a theory of change? What is communism? Who is Gramsci? Who's Negri? What is socialism? It's like, and so it was, and I think a lot of us were catalyzed by our productive failures in Occupy to go learn a whole lot of different things. And I think we're more powerful now as a result.
Good point.
Nancy?
Sure. adding to what's already been said. I mean, to me, it marked a sort of seismic shift in the nature of political discourse in the United States, in which, I mean, just the language of 99% versus 1%. I mean, you want to talk about oligarchy. That's not analytically precise language for actually understanding class and class structure in the United States. But what a powerful rhetorical mobilizing device. So it brought Wall Street, the malefactors of wealth, back in the center as the main bad guys. It raised the issue of class. It raised not just inequality, but the sort of whole dynamic of siphoning wealth up to the top. So, I mean, these were themes that were quite marginal in US politics. You know, in a sense, it harked back perhaps certainly to the 30s or to the 60s, where these kinds of things were talked about. So it was extremely important, I think. Also, bodies in public space. We're having a great conversation here on Zoom, but, you know, as Mario Savio famously said, throw your body into the gears of the machine if you really want to stop it, whether it's by withdrawing your labor and occupying a factory, or by blocking traffic, or taking a public square. That's great. And now, what I want to say, the negatives, or at least the weaknesses, the overall ethos, and I was a regular visitor to Zuccotti Park, but it was mainly my students who sort of really camped out there. And essentially, I mentioned Kropotkin before, they're basically all anarchists at heart. They had a principled objection to having any programmatic demands, to having any organization or structure. I think I'm happy to say that at least some of them learned that, you know, those were not, you know, attitudes that would actually lead to, you know, a serious effort at social change. So, and I'm not sure how much of that anarchism among young people is still afoot in the land. Maybe not as much, but I'm going to teach a course with a colleague, an Italian colleague who earned her anarchism, you know, through generations of Italian struggles in Italy, on anarchism and socialism, and including all the historic debates. I think it's worth revisiting, at least for those of us who are doing the intellectual side of this, looking at those debates and whether they must be antithetical, whether they're, you know, ways of integrating insights and so on and so forth. But Occupy was sort of a great moment. It's what made the Bernie Sanders campaign possible. Obama, as you said, immediately sort of changed his campaign rhetoric, not that it changed anything he actually did in office. And the most impressive thing to me was, you know, like about 2, maybe 3 weeks in, already like 70, 60, high 60s% of Americans had a favorable view of Occupy. That was astounding. You know, it's true, there were high favorable views of Black Lives Matter at one point too, and that, you know, shrunk. But I don't know, to me, it showed that there was a lot of possibility for a revived form of pro-working class politics in the United States, which was a great inspiration to me.
Could I just add one other thing briefly about Occupy? I'm glad you brought this up, Peter. You know, for all its faults, and there's nothing I disagree with folks here, is that it was a model of how self-organizing society can look. It was a kind of future in the present, as C.L.R. James once put it. You know, Douglas, you said you went to Occupy encampments. You probably had similar ones there. There was childcare, there were libraries, there were there was food, there were bathrooms. It was all self-organized. Sometimes they got a little bit of money from somebody who wanted to support it. There were legal services available. People lived there for several weeks and they took care of each other. And for all its failings and limits, I think that was the most powerful example, is that it taught young people that we can self-organize. We don't need a political party. We don't need unions. We don't need to demand reform. That we, by being organized ourselves, can construct a different society. And not to sensationalize it or idealize it, but these were small encampments that sometimes included thousands of people. And I think it's left a legacy. And I think the fact that we are seeing this youthful insurgence happening in the last few years is directly correlated to Occupy. And I want to add one other element, is that Occupy was international. And we shouldn't forget that movement overturned governments in Latin America. In Argentina, it led to hundreds of workers taking over and running their factories. And in the Middle East, it brought down the Egyptian dictatorship, at least for a little while. So, while we didn't change the system here, around the world, it was a movement that had a lot of success.
Well, as time wraps.
Add one very
please.
quick sentence,
Yes,
because
please.
it follows directly on what Robert just said about the international dimension. I just want to mention, but that in both Spain and Greece, their movements, the Indignarios and so on, actually led to the formation of new left-wing political parties, so this was very different from the United States. It didn't have that anarchist idea. It was that the old socialist and labor parties were, they had basically cooperated with neoliberalism. They were discredited, and that it was time to build a new kind of left political party. In both cases, it didn't work out perfectly, that's for sure. And in fact, in Greece, it was kind of a disaster, but that's neither here nor there. That's a sort of attempt to take that energy and find a way to sustain it, to create a form in which it can sustain itself, rather than just dissipate once the police clear the park. That's all.
I mean, the one thing I would add, for me, and it kind of wraps it up in some ways, is speaking honestly. I mean, I think my suspicion of top-down and scaled solutions came from Occupy and my motivations for Occupy. I felt, even though I wrote an article before he was elected that he would do this, I felt let down by Obama, who said, we are the change we've been waiting for, and did not develop a government that invited me in to be the change I was waiting for. And I felt like Occupy was us saying, all right, Obama, we're not going to wait for you. We're just going to do this ourselves without Democratic Party, without government help or involvement. And it really did. It's interesting. It was a trauma in some ways. The Obama presidency was a trauma to those of us who went to Occupy to kind of take these matters into our own hands. And we had been let down by, again, it was inappropriate to put so much weight on a president, but he didn't invite us in a certain way. And I think then we kind of felt we got to take this thing ourselves.
So as we kind of wrap the program up, I would like to pose one last time to all three of you, and if we can go kind of in succession. And since we just got through with you, Douglas, why don't you kind of start, and then we can go Robert, and then we can end with Nancy. Where do we go from here?
Well, not to get too Ram Dass on you, we start by actually being here and observing what our conditions are. I said, the first thing I said this afternoon in my first talk was, I've been confused. I've been mistaken for a futurist my whole life because I write about technology. I am a presentist. I observe conditions on the ground. And I think that where we go from here to start is we be here, we see what's going on, we recognize the injustices, everything, to me, everything Nancy's been talking about, particularly about the abuse of people who are involved in what we call the social economy and the caretaking economy. This is all happening right now. What we do first is open our eyes to conditions on the ground. And then as we see them, I think we will be compelled to move in the ways that are appropriate.
Robert?
Yeah, well, just to kind of piggyback on you, Douglas, I think even more so that we look at where we're at right now and understand that different forces of repression are really tactics in response to our power. So when we look at widespread AI automation of work, when we see inflation and interest rates going up, when we see, the inevitable, there's going to be massive budget cuts and layoffs, those are not happening if we're weak. Repression in some ways reflects the power that we have. And I think that starting in the present, for me, is not a Ram Dass moment at all. It's a Marx moment. And that's essentially what Marx did. And what he left us is his understanding of capitalism in England in the mid to late 1800s was, here's how capitalism is currently organized. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that and apply it to the present so that we can really understand what's going on and how people are struggling, and then take that to the next level.
Nancy?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, let me just start with Robert's last point about Marx and so on. Yeah, I agree that we need an understanding of capitalism as it functions now, which, as I said, is as a cannibal, and to understand how its cannibalizing thrust lies at the root of all of the major problems we face, which appear too often to be discrete and disconnected from one another. My diagnosis is that we are in one of those rare moments of general crisis in capitalism's history. It's not a sectoral crisis, not just an economic crisis or just an ecological crisis or just a crisis of care or democracy. But all of these things sort of rolled up into one. I think it's an extremely severe crisis. I don't think that means it will be resolved soon. It can take decades, unfortunately, for these things to resolve. So I do, returning to Gramsci, I do think when I use this as a title of the previous book, I think this quote, "The old is dying, the new cannot be born. In the ensuing interregnum emerge all manner of morbid symptoms." We are living in the morbid symptoms, but we also have the power and potentially, right, the vision and energy and so on to mobilize for a non-morbid response to this. And I think it has to be fundamentally an anti-capitalist response. Now, we haven't talked what that means. I'm happy to claim the label democratic socialism, but I add a whole bunch of qualifiers that are boringly feminist, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, ecological, democratic. Okay, and I have some very sketchy ideas about what that means, which are laid out in the last chapter of Cannibal Capitalism, but we need a lot more thinking. To counteract back to the very first point that we opened with, or that I opened with, when I thought about the question of what is the oligarchic ideology, and I said, well, today it's one part of it anyway is TINA. There is no alternative. Not everyone has to be involved in, designing social systems. But there has to be a widespread sense among enough people that there actually are alternatives, and that we have a name for it, and that, we have at least some sketchy ideas of how it's different from what we have now. And so that, again, there's at least the possibility of connecting dots, of accumulating movements instead of having them dissipate, having them sort of radicalize and broaden and so on. That's all.
You're not making no noise.
Sorry about that. I have sticky keyboard that will not allow me to activate when I need to activate. You know, I really want to offer my gratitude to each of you. This has been such an amazing day, and thank you all for gracing our halls and lending your knowledge, you know, and reflections to this just immensely important series of subjects. So Nancy Fraser, Robert Ovetz, Douglas Rushkoff, so honored to have been able to have all of you in the house the whole day. I feel like, you know, such a treat. I also want to take a moment to thank all of you in the audience. I mean, there's so many comments in the chat. It's been so lively. Everyone's so engaged. All of you help complete this circle. So thank you for being with us throughout the course of the day. A huge thanks to W.W. Norton, to Pluto Press, you know, to Verso Books. Again, tonight's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, our publishing program, educational outreach, all of it dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So be safe, be well, everyone. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks,
Please visit
everybody.
City Lights and buy books.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.